Insanity and mental issues are something that popular culture and arts deals with on regular basis. But in games, these themes are rarely seen. But there are exceptions, and Dreamweb is one of them. Hello and welcome to Retro Games in Rally English. My name is Juho Kuorikoski, I'm a Finnish journalist and a non-fiction author, and I'm here to talk about old games in my very Finnish English. In this video, I'll be talking about Dreamweb, an action-adventure game released in 1994. The game is somewhat of a cult classic, as it mixes heavy themes with macabre humor and extreme violence. Set in a similar cyberpunk world as Blade Runner, Dreamweb is a hard-hitting narrative experience that sticks in your mind long after you completed the game. Although it's been well over 2 decades since the release of the game, in terms of the narrative, Dreamweb is superior to many other games. To get to the bottom of this, we need to dig deeper. Dreamweb is billions of years old. It's vital to humanity, it is eternal. But now this ancient construct is under a threat, for evil is rising. The 7 keepers of the web need a champion to vanquish the evil, and this is where you step in. This sounds absurd, but it's only the surface level of the story. This is exactly the kind of stuff that a mentally deranged individual would think. And this is where Dreamweb becomes interesting. Although the game was released in 1994, Dreamweb is still one of the few games that deal with mental disorders and insanity and do this through the game mechanics. While Dreamweb is a sci-fi noir game in a cyberpunk setting, it's also somewhat of a psychological study to the human mind. To achieve this, the game came bundled with a 40-page novel titled Diary of a Madman. This served as a copy protection method, but also a vehicle for the themes presented in the game. Thanks to this combination, Dreamweb is probably one of the strangest games of the 90s, a masterpiece in a narrative sense, but purely as a game, not so much. As a whole, Dreamweb is intriguing and, first of all, interesting. Dreamweb is often said to be the most depressing game of all time. One could argue that this statement doesn't hold true today, but many of the themes presented in the game are as valid today as they were in the 90s. When the game makes you question your choices, morals, and even the ability to choose, it certainly does something right. Don't let the looks fool you, there's certainly a lot more than meets the eye. Dreamweb is a top-down action-adventure reminiscent of Origin Systems' Ultima 6. The user interface hoards almost 2/3 of the screen, so all the action is portrayed in a small window. While the game may not be a sight to behold, the user interface gets the necessary stuff done once you get used to it. A lot bigger issue is the tiny action window. All the items in the game are microscopic thanks to this, so there's a lot of pixel hunting. To make matters worse, you can literally pick up everything in the game, and against the traditions of adventure games, your inventory is limited to few item slots. It really makes you wonder what on earth were they thinking when the game screen is smaller than some of the smartphone screens, but there's a huge and totally pointless picture of our grease-haired hero that takes up a whole third of the screen. But if you can get past these issues, rest of the game offers different and delightfully depressing take on the classic myth of a hero. The greatest achievement of the game is that it makes you question everything, and on top of that, Dreamweb doesn't give straight answers. Your goal is to murder 7 individuals to keep Dreamweb alive. These individuals are vague representations of the 7 cardinal sins. You're tasked by 7 mystical men in robes, but it's left unclear that are these men real or just products of the main character's imagination. Ryan, the hero of the game, is either a messiah or a lunatic. He doesn't question his mental state, while it's painfully obvious that he has issues, thanks to the diary bundled with the game. In Ryan's dreams, he's the chosen one who's tasked to save Dreamweb and humanity, but he's scribbling nonsense to his diary. When Ryan's boss lays him off in the beginning of the game, it's time to buy a gun and save the world. Dreamweb's narrative is a bleak mirror of the way how heroes are usually portrayed. In games, the main character is tasked to do some weird stuff, but the motives are almost always virtuous, or at least spelled out. The uncertainty becomes the driving force in Dreamweb, because the player keeps on asking questions that the game refuses to answer. You keep on playing just to understand Ryan's motives, but the more you play, the more ominous it gets. On top of that, Ryan never questions his actions. To advance in the game, player has no choice but to task Ryan to execute the orders given to him. The atmosphere is borderline agonizing. Is Ryan willingly making these choices murders, or is he just a marionette fulfilling his destiny as the savior of the human race? These questions are the driving force of the game and the main reason to look past the obvious flaws of the game. The low-resolution graphics help immersing in the game. Thanks to the top-down view, it's mandatory to fill the graphical gaps with your imagination. The difference between a cult game and a classic is sometimes pretty narrow, but in the case of Dreamweb, this difference can be seen a lot more clearly. Purely from the perspective of game design, Dreamweb is a relic that is in a desperate need for a modernization. But on the other hand, the story and especially the way it's told is something quite remarkable. When everything else is uncertain but your next task, you begin to question everything. The creative process behind Dreamweb is twofold and a marvelous example on how traditional media can complement a digital game. Dreamweb was a personal project of Neil Dudwell and David Dew. They were barely out of their teenage years when the game was released. Dudwell and Dew were childhood friends and they studied in the same school. Dudwell and Dew experimented with a lot of ideas and the end result was Dreamweb. Cyberpunk setting was selected as it was popular in the 1990s. Although the game is reminiscent of Blade Runner, the developers have stated that Highlander was the main source of inspiration. The initial setting is similar both in Highlander and Dreamweb. The hero is sent to kill people. Mental issues came to play when science fiction author Stephen Marley was tasked to write the Diary of a Madman. The book functions as a secondary plot device for the game. Thanks to the diary, Ryan's motives are turned upside down and the insanity becomes the central theme of the game. Marley played the finished game and wrote the diary afterwards. The initial idea came from the company that published the game, Creative Reality, who wanted to use a novel to prime the story of the game. Marley, however, took the idea further. Instead of working as an introduction to the world and the story, the Diary of a Madman functions as the second side of the narrative that, in a way, turns the whole setting of the game upside down. While it's common that games, especially retro games, have parts of the plot and backstory tucked away in the instruction manual, the way Dreamweb approaches this is very different. You can play the game without the diary's full context, you still need it for door codes, but to truly understand the meaning of the narrative, the novel is an integral part of the game. The technical aspects of the game were changed constantly during development, but the top-down perspective was selected for the sake of convenience. The developers have stated that in a way player acts as a god directing Ryan by his or her actions. As the user interface hoards most of the screen real estate, compromises had to be done. The magnifying glass in the bottom of the screen gives some relief for the tedious pixel hunting that will most certainly get to your nerves. While Dreamweb can be seen as an adventure game, there's no branching dialogue trees. Dew and Dudwell weren't particularly interested in dialogue trees, so the interactivity was stripped from the text. As the intention is to murder people, the consequences of violence are portrayed in a very realistic manner. While the graphics are in very low resolution, the sheer brutality of the game is still almost shocking. The developers have stated that they don't consider Dreamweb to be that violent, but I disagree. The game had a mixed reception. Some of the critics loved it, some hated it. The same thing happened with consumers. This is what separates a classic game from a cult game. Dreamweb is a marvelous example of this. It's loved but also hated with almost equal passion. Thanks to these kinds of extreme reactions, it's safe to say that Dreamweb gets you going. While it evokes feelings from both ends of the spectrum of emotions, it gets you thinking. In this regard, it doesn't really matter what the critics say. If game, or any product of popular culture, can move something inside you, it has achieved something special. In conclusion, Dreamweb is a child of its time. A mixed bag from the perspective of game design, but in terms of the narrative, the game was well ahead of its time. If you haven't played Dreamweb, I strongly recommend that you give it a go. The game is freeware and it runs flawlessly on ScumVM, so there's really no excuse why you shouldn't test it out. If you can get past the clumsy user interface, the game offers quite a unique experience, although depressing one. Dreamweb is totally worth playing even today. But as always, the race was hard and tire was bad. Until next time, Kuorikoski out.